Welcome to the Tank Podcast. I'm Tina, Tank's full-time voiceover artist. In this episode, Faisal Devji talks about the emergence of extreme right-wing politics in Europe and its relationship with 20th century fascism.
One of the problems in talking about the rise of the European right is that we tend to drift back to historical precedents and genealogies within which fascism plays a crucial role. Now, of course, it plays a crucial role for a reason, because you do have people on the right in Europe who have fascist sympathies, and even worse. But in a way, this is not probably the right way of thinking about it. In fact, what I find interesting is how the language of European fascism from the 1930s and 40s has been exported globally and is meant to explain everything. So Timothy Snyder, for instance, thought that the Trump administration would give rise to fascism. And now he thinks that this is happening in Eastern Europe as well. Well, can this moment of European history, hugely important and extraordinarily violent, really define and describe everything? I don't think so. I think when you look more closely at the European right, and of course there are many variants of it, what you see that is interesting about it is that it has taken on the language of the former colonial subjects of these European countries. And I find that utterly fascinating. For instance, you have this idea that, famously expressed in the best-selling French novelist Michel Houellebecq's book, Submission, this vision of, as it were, a stronger, a more self-believing, more confident civilization, in his case Islam, which comes into Europe and will basically take over, not because it's good, but because it has, as it were, the belief in its own virtue and the strength of that belief and self-confidence, and it'll just run over the kind of liberal, relativistic European elites and Islamize Europe. Now, this story is really the kind of story that used to be told in the ex-colonies by former colonized subjects. How are we to deal with the West? Europe is a stronger civilization, not just technologically, but maybe culturally. It's going to take us over. We need to somehow figure out how to create a modus vivendi. So what you have is a colonial story coming back to the metropolis, to Europe. That's one way in which this happens, but there are other ways as well. There's the largely American, but now increasingly European story of the Great Replacement, that white people are going to be made a minority in their own countries. Again, this was a story that had been previously retailed in the ex-colonies, and it was retailed with specific reference to genocidal European campaigns in the Americas, where you do have this happening, and in places like Australia, where you really have a Great Replacement. So now the fantasy world of the European right inverts the story, and it's Europe itself that has become, as it were, a colonial possession of whether it's immigrants, whether it's Islam, whatever it is. So I think that really, it's a kind of unadmitted grappling with the history of empire that is really informing the discourse and the narrative of the European right, and not really the story of fascism or even communism. And that's why immigrants are at the center of it, precisely because they represent that moment of empire. Now, what else is going on here? A specifically, fascinating, indeed crucial aspect of this, if you will, post-colonial story in Europe is the fact that so many parties on the right have dedicated themselves to achieving or re-achieving the independence of their countries. Again, classic colonial language. We want our independence. Who do you want your independence from? Well, migrants and Islam and all the rest, but increasingly from the EU itself. And I think this really is important because, as the sociologist Olivier Roy has argued, a lot of this culture war language on the right really has to do not with immigration. It has to do with the fact that the EU has destroyed the sovereignties of European states. They have willingly entered into a federal structure by getting rid of their currencies, their separate currencies, and indeed by, as it were, placing their armed forces under more sort of joint forms of command. They no longer have that form of sovereignty, which was often exercised against their neighbors, let us remember, to sustain their sense of themselves and their independence. So in this context, how do you remake what national identity is if you don't really have sovereignty of an old-fashioned kind? Well, you can do it culturally, you can do it against immigrants, but in the end, you do it against the EU itself. You need to reclaim sovereignty in some way. Now, this, of course, is particularly true in the European right. Perhaps ironically, given the fact that Britain was never really part of the EU, Britain has set the precedent here through Brexit. But even in Britain, you have at least two versions of what used to be only colonial concerns, independence movements. You have UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which was really crucial in the run-up to Brexit until it was gazumped by the Tories, by the Conservative Party. And that, of course, wants real old-fashioned sovereignty, our currency back, defenses back, our army, etc., all of that stuff. And then on the other side, in Britain, you have Scottish nationalism, the SNP, which wants its own independence, but its independence is of the EU kind. It's an independence that is cultural and that is civic, and that's not about having your own currency. In fact, they don't want their own currency. So even in a single country like Britain, you have these alternative visions of independence, both arguably taken from the world of empire and post-colonialism. So where does race really come into this story? It's there, but it's there in a very kind of colonial way, as I've argued. It's not playing the role that it might have played in the immediate post-colonial period when you have immigration to European countries. You know, how can we deal with these people? They're foreign, they're alien, and all the rest. And that is why actually race plays a role and yet doesn't play a role in so many of these movements. All over the right in Europe, the effort is to make people of different racial complexions and origins into true French people or true Italians or true Austrians or whatever it is. It is not really to expel them. A completely different logic. And I think this is the case because the real issue is structural, and it has to do not with a division between what's European and what's extra-European. It's a division within Europe itself. So I've already said how even in the United Kingdom you have two visions of independence, the SNP and UKIP. In Europe, you have a similar situation. In fact, you have many more. They're not just two visions available, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Italy. How do they really want to be part of the EU? Will their desire for independence remain confined to guarding borders and keeping immigrants out or refugees out? Or is the real story really about two quite distinct narratives of what the world looks like and should look like? One is the neoliberal narrative of the West, of Western Europe, where diversity, everyone chooses their own pronouns, sexual, racial, cultural, all governed by the law of the market and niche marketing. On the other side, in Eastern Europe, you have the desire for, as it were, more homogeneous forms of nationalism, strong state structures, and a suspicion of neoliberal capitalism. The cleavage is not really about immigration, though that might appear to be one of its signs. The cleavage is far more fundamental than that, I think. So that even on the right in Western Europe, in France, for instance, there is an acceptance of homosexuality, of irreligiosity, etc. You're not going to find that in Hungary. In that sense, Hungary and Poland are much more like Russia, which is supposedly on the other side of Europe, than they are like France or Germany, to say nothing of Britain. Now, I think what we are seeing here is, if you will, a choice between two political forms. One is revolution, which is historically linked to the left, and which is a teleological form. It's a way of imagining a future and bringing it about. No party on the right actually, in my view, is revolutionary in that sense. They all seem to be fixated rather on the other major political form, which is civil war. Civil war does not have a trajectory. It is meant to be something, or it is often seen as being a situation which is somehow always lying in abeyance, which is lying in wait, which can come up at any moment. The whole point of civil war, that it's circular conflict, it doesn't actually have a resolution. And a lot of the language on the right is a civil war type of language. We need to emphasize, they argue, the cleavages in our societies and engage in a good fight. But this good fight doesn't really have an end point. It's the vision of a civil war. So I wonder if Europe is actually faced with these two broad trajectories. Either you have a political imagination which is about batten down the hatches, guard the borders, and have a civil war within to clear things up, or you have a revolutionary vision which actually is trying to take you somewhere. Both involve violence, but the violence of one is very different from the violence of the other as far as the political imagination is concerned.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.